Ms. Kraemer. When you're ready, you may begin with your opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gretchen Kraemer. I am the Division Director of the DHS Division for the Iowa Attorney General's Office. We have 50 attorneys in our division, more than 100 in the office as a whole. I've had that role for about 3 years, and I've been with the AG's office for almost 13, and it's a great place to work. Y'all have seen me twice already this year. This is the third time, so there's not a lot of new information that I have to share with y'all. So one thing that is not new is I'm still not a judge. I'm still here before you as a practicing attorney who has not had judicial experience. And what's also not new is I would still like to be a judge, and I hope that I have enough experience that you all will consider me as a competitive candidate. One thing that is also not new is I still have quite a bit of appellate experience. If you look in the application materials, I have 163 decided appellate cases. And that doesn't include the cases that are still pending before the court or cases that were dismissed for some reason or another. In preparing the writing samples for y'all this time, I finished my application on September 30th, so I decided to pick what I had done in September for lack of a better way of doing it. And in September, I did 7 appellate briefs before the court. I had 4 final briefs, 2 proof briefs, and a response. Termination of parental right appeals are on a fast track on an expedited docket, so you do something called a response rather than a full brief. I did a motion to dismiss before the appellate courts. I did the motion for summary judgment in the Western District of Wisconsin, 2 administrative hearings, 1 district court hearing in Henry County, in addition to agency advice, multiple work groups, supervisory activities such as interviews. And I think that also shows just in that month. Every month is different, so I can't say that October would be the same, but the variety of things that I've had the opportunity to do and how I can draw on all of those experiences before the court. One thing that is new is I'm going to be the co-chair for the Committee on Legal Issues for the American Psychological Association next year. The APA has a very active amicus program before the United States Supreme Court, and one of their interests and one of the things that COLI does is help vet the positions that are taken by the APA, and the APA tries to use scientific research that could benefit legal decision-making in one way or another. They do take substantive positions from time to time, but primarily their goal is to educate and to provide information on a different type of I guess, analysis. And actually, my work on COLI is one of the reasons that I applied initially. I find the intersection very interesting, where science can be influential to legal decision-making. And some of our discussions that we had with COLI, there's obviously a good group of information that's out there, and people who are interested in that know how to find it. But how do you reach more people? And I guess my position on that is if you want lawyers and judges to read this kind of information, you should write it where lawyers and judges read things. And one way to do that is to hold the pen as a member of the court. I think that the Iowa Supreme Court has done a really nice job of picking up in some areas where science can be informative to legal decision-making. Obviously, in the juvenile decision-making is one area. The United States Supreme Court had some substantive death penalty jurisprudence, which then came down through the Iowa courts as well. And the APA was significant in its amicus work on that. Implicit bias is a new area that's coming before the courts. And the Iowa Supreme Court has talked about that as well. In some of the work groups that I've been on lately, again, science has come up as informative to legal decision-making. I was on a juvenile justice work group last week, and there was some information presented that for low-risk juvenile offenders, it's actually better to do nothing. That any sort of intervention by the juvenile justice system can be a harm and can make things worse, have worse outcomes for the juveniles than just leaving them alone, which I think is really important when the courts are making decisions that impact public safety and impact the lives of these individuals. Child welfare, also, removal is a harm. And not only is it a harm, it can be considered an adverse childhood experience which has health determinants, including longevity. And so one of the things that DHS is doing, also because of new federal legislation, is really rethinking practices in a new way. And so I think that all of these, science can inform legal decision making. Obviously not in every case, but to the extent that it can be applicable, I think that's something that I could bring to the court. My third writing sample, which was not done in September, I picked because I think it shows that I write briefly and succinctly. I like to tell a good story. This was a case of first impression. It was about Medicaid regulations, which are about as dry can be, and judicial review, also fairly dry, highly regulatory topic. And so what I tried to do is just talk to the court. And I was successful in that particular motion, but I hope that you all can see how even in super dry areas, I do try to tell the story that the facts will allow. I've had a number of cases of first impression working for the Attorney General's office. It's really interesting, and I'm glad that I've had that opportunity, and I think that would be of benefit to the court. I taught as an adjunct for about 10 years. Again, blending legal decision-making and psychological science. I took a break as my kids got older, and they're a little more self-sufficient now, so other than driving them around, I think I might try to get back into that a little bit. One more sort of tidbit that I often hear about in interviews is interesting things on your resume. I was a synchronized swimmer in college, which is not something I'd ever done before. And at the University of Richmond, you had to pass a basic swimming test, and so my coach in my swimming class invited me to apply or to try out, and I did. I've never done anything like that before. I can tell you all the tips on if you want to gel over your hair so it stays in place. But sometimes the best way to try something new is just to dive in, and it's been one of my better experiences in life. And even though I've not been a judge before, if given the opportunity, I would dive in here as well. I know how to do the research, I know how to get up to speed, and I think I would do a good job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The Commission would like to ask some questions at this time, and so we'll begin with Mr. Hoytik.
Okay.
You have a tremendous amount of appellate experience, which I think is really interesting. In the background where I've worked for some large law firms where we recognize we had some people who were very good trial lawyers and so-so appellate lawyers, and we had some people who were very good appellate lawyers and so-so trial lawyers. I mean, good, but there's a distinction between the practices, and I think you referenced arguing in the Western District of Wisconsin at district court. And what is your thought on the difference between a district court judge and an appellate court judge, and perhaps the different skill sets and the practices?
Sure. I think the district court judge has a lot of responsibility for shaping the record, and maybe a little bit more wrangling than is necessary for the appellate courts. The record is already developed before the appellate courts, so I think the appellate courts also necessarily have additional time for research and writing because they will control the arc of the law in a different way than the district court will. I think both are very important jobs, but I think the research and writing position suits me a little better.
Ms. Valentine?
Thank you. Going back to your comments about science influencing legal outcomes, what happens if science butts heads with precedent? What happens then?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think that happens. And I think that's where you look for the nuance and you look for the way to integrate in the same way where precedent can butt heads with itself at times. I think it's really important to be aware of precedent, but also be mindful of new information and finding a way to do justice, which is the ultimate goal.
Thank you.
Mr. Berger?
No question.
Ms. O'Brien?
Thank you. I'm just thinking about the science, and it would be important, wouldn't it, for attorneys to be tuned into science so that they could develop the record in a way that the appeals court could incorporate that, right?
So I think it can come in two ways. Obviously, if it comes in the record, it's you have the opportunity to develop the witness testimony on it and push on it a little bit the way you can with cross-examination. But I have seen a number of appellate decisions that will reference, treatises and materials. In the child welfare area, we get that fairly frequently, and so there is another avenue as well to bring out some things that attorneys need to be thinking about as they're preparing their cases.
Thank you.
Mr. Sukup?
No question.
Ms. Conover?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Bloom?
So, in my lifetime, there's been pretty dramatic changes to the way we handle the mentally ill. And in our society, we have more frequent examples of mass shootings, things like that. So I'm trying to ask several applicants about technology questions. We have so much data coming about people in our society that we live with, and what do you see, especially like in being in the Attorney General's office, how accessing this data, analyzing this data, might give us insights to which people are more dangerous? Because we're not going to go incarcerating or chaining up mentally ill people, right? So I'm just sort of curious. You might have a unique insight on that, which I think will be an area the law is going to develop, and it's going to have to dramatically change in the next 10 years. So do you have any thoughts on that? I think we talked about that a little bit in our interview. We didn't do one this time. But.
Sure. No, I think that's a great question, and I think that's a really opportune way for science to inform legal decision making. If you look at the research, and there is research on violence and people with mental illness, people with mental illness are not violent at a greater likelihood than people from the general population. If you drill down on that a little bit more deeply, the predictors are people in crisis and people with substance abuse disorders. So if you want to shape public policy and try to discern the people who are more at risk, then those would be the areas that you should focus the inquiry on, and intervening in people who have substance abuse and on intervening with people who are in crisis. And I think the state is really trying to work towards that in developing the crisis centers. And I know it's not statewide, but a lot of places have mobile crisis units, so it's not just the police going out to intervene with somebody in crisis, but it's people who have some additional training to help that. I absolutely think that research can help inform those predictive areas of the law and help. The challenge is that research group data can never be applied with 100% confidence to any one person. And so group data can tell you likelihoods and it can tell you risk factors, but it can never tell you whether the person in front of you will in fact do something very dangerous or not. So it's one more thing that I think can be used to inform decision making, but it's obviously not going to answer all the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Gray.
So from your letters of references and the people have called me, it's obvious that the job you're doing now, you're doing a fantastic job, and you'd be very hard to replace. Why is it that you'd like to be on the Court of Appeals instead of doing this fantastic job you're doing?
Well, I love my job, and I think it would be great to stay as well. I'm really interested in trying to advance not only my career, but where I think the law could go, and this intersection of I really like interdisciplinary work, and I think this would be another way to further that interest.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Law?
No questions.
Ms. Pearson?
No question.
Ms. Stanger?
Thank you. One of the questions I've been asking folks is to dive into something personally that has impacted or brought you to where you are today. We have some incredible candidates here, top of the class, valedictorians, incredible professional successes. I'd like you to share something personally or personal success or something that maybe has shaped you to bring you here today.
So I've had a pretty great life. So I'm not going to be telling you a story of a terribly adverse event. But I grew up in a really small town, and I was pretty nerdy as far as things go. And in a smaller town, there may be fewer people who are of any particular group. And I was pretty shy growing up. And so going to college for me, I went all the way across the United States, from this little tiny town in Oregon that's barely on the map to my college in Virginia. And the thing that I think I've learned is to just try. You never know what's going to be interesting until you try it. And I went across this country to school. I did my internship in Texas. I tried. I wasn't initially interested in law. I was interested in psychology and interested in public policy, and so I went to a joint degree program. Became much more interested in law. My first job, I ended up doing products liability with Whitfield and Eddy. Not particularly handy person, but one of my first cases was it was a throttle cable case on a dirt bike. I don't ride dirt bikes, but it was pretty clear from the petition that what they were complaining of, they were saying that the throttle cable stuck, and so the bike, stopped working. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, it broke, right? If it's stuck, it should be going faster, not stopping. And it turns out with the engineers, that's what happened. But I would never have learned that if I didn't try something new and try something interesting. And I think sort of that openness to experience brought me to the job I'm in and brings me before you today. Just try it. You never know.
Thank you.
Mr. Bevel.
No questions.
Mrs. Sinclair.
No questions.
Mr. Goodman.
No questions.
Mr. Spies.
Ms. Kraemer, one of your biggest fans, Judge Mark Bennett, has been a pioneer in exploring the role of implicit bias in decision-making in the courts. And more and more often we see, I shouldn't say creeping into, but finding their way into judicial opinions or studies about human behavior, the way jurors decide, the way judges decide. And you appear to have a particular aptitude when it comes to the way people think and make decisions. But also, a judge is kind of bound by the record. What role do you see for bringing into appellate decisions sociologic studies, psychological studies, studies about human behavior, and how those play a role in the appellate process?
Oh, I do think you're bound by the record, and where I see them coming in as expounding on as additional bases for the decision made. And I think it's a way to sort of shape the arc of the law and encourage practitioners to look at these things as they're trying their cases.
And judges.
And judges as well. And that's how I've seen it being used with the courts now. Obviously, it's ideal if it's brought up in the district court where you can sort of press on it a little, but there is still a role for it in the appellate courts as well. And I think it's really important to look at decision making and to be aware and open to different ways of analyzing it, because the overall goal is to be fair. I think a lot of the psychological research will show that people will have maybe a decision-making tendency that they're not aware of. I mean, clearly that's what implicit bias is about. But even things like cognitive heuristics, where you're going to something that happened more recently or something that's more salient to you and maybe ascribing that a greater importance than it would ordinarily find as far as like base rate data. So it's important to be aware of those things when you're making decisions.
Thanks.
Mr. Horbach.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being
Thank
here,
you.
Ms. Kraemer. We appreciate your application, and we wish you well.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Can we move the microphone a little bit closer to the applicants?
Absolutely.